The full recovery of my pink eye is in progress. It still hurts, and my whole head feels like it's infected with things, I guess pink things, but it doesn't look as heinous as it did before. And I've strategically positioned all camera things to have the pink eye not front and center of this conversation.
It's your right eye, correct?
It is my right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's quite hurty. Is hurty's a word, right?
Yeah. That's a robot. It's an
Hurt,
AI.
hurty the robot. Yeah, hurty the pink eye robot. If I didn't need a robot for this, I needed good old fashioned antibiotics formulated to drop straight in the eye hole.
Do you know what the prescription's for? Which antibiotic?
Yeah, but I forgot the name of it already.
That's all right.
Promixium something. It's the eye one. There's
Yeah.
a I
I
got it
wonder,
out of my mind. I got nothing. It's on the label. I had a reference there, but no, I have no clue.
one of the big, obviously it's given way to more pressing concerns, but one of the big topics several years back, it's probably still relevant, around antibiotic resistance
Yeah,
was prescribing antibiotics that haven't been cultured, where the specific strain or the specific species, um, not species, but the specific type of
strain.
strain, exactly, strain of bacteria hasn't been cultured. And a lot of times doctors prescribe antibiotics for viruses. And there's a same thing in cattle or in livestock. And I think the popular wisdom is that this is a big contributor to antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria.
There's, as far as I know, there's no way to determine whether a pink eye infection, conjunctivitis is the formal word for it. There's no way of knowing whether conjunctivitis is contracted from a bacteria or a virus, other than if it responds to antibiotics, then it is bacterial. If it doesn't respond to antibiotics, then it's viral.
Yeah, that seems like
It seems like a way to breed super strains of bacteria eventually. I don't think that I wasn't expecting to have a global pandemic in my lifetime, necessarily. And I I'm going to be really bummed when we get to super bacteria and we no longer have effective antibiotics and we're all scrambling to solve that problem. And I feel like it's going to be similar where I thought it was going to be different and I didn't think that was the thing I was going to have to worry about. But we'll always have hand washing, thank God.
yeah. I think for a lot of um it's another discussion.
I have an amazing seg though. Are you ready for the seg?
Let's do it.
What incentivizes, sorry, hold on. Let me think it through for half a second before I speak. The segue is this. There are all kinds of things that society needs that require a lot of investment dollars and a lot of time to develop and to invent. And where that development and invention happens has a big impact on what the products that we get to see, whether it's medical products or tech products or other physical goods. It has a huge impact. So when you don't have either when you don't have a system for how you formally do research and development, or when that system is in flux, or when that system is out of date, or when that system is undergoing a period of significant disruption and change, it can cause a great deal of stability to sort of the pace of what we're expecting to see in terms of product that's actually delivered. So that's what happened with Corona. It's not that there's not a good system for drug development. It's that drug development can't ramp up immediately.
Yeah. Um and I think that's why historically I think we can call Bell Labs an institution.
Oh,
Um
totally.
yeah, I think that's why historically institutions like Bell Labs are both fascinating and probably as impactful as any little known institution outside of the tech world, outside of technological circles. Um, and I don't mean tech necessarily as Silicon Valley, but technology. People know Bell, but the general population doesn't know Bell Labs. Probably one of the most important institutions in the history of the country.
I'm not gonna try and force you to quantify whether and how the general population knows Bell Labs, but I will say that the heyday of, let's call it, private public research institutions, where they're not government backed directly, um, they're not fully private, they're not universities, and their main reason for existing is to basically hire a bunch of researchers and have them develop new things. That a time when that was common is pretty far behind us. These labs have not had their heyday for quite some time, and I don't have a good answer for where R&D comes from now. And
I do.
normally I'm a pretty big optimist about how things are going to go in the future. This is a case where I'm not exactly sure what replaced the big labs, and nor am I sure whether it's good that they don't exist anymore. Where's R&D coming from?
Defense.
Oh my god, I went to a defense show, and fine, okay, like, sort, maybe, kinda, but I think that my counterpoint to this is, if we're counting on the defense industry for innovations that can then be carried over to consumer products, the defense industrial complex, where it's more about contracting than it is about inventing, I mean, that's alive and well.
Well, you've heard of DARPA, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've heard of DARPA. Yep.
Well, the internet, I think, if not spawned from DARPA, the internet was originally a defense initiative. Um, so I think obviously the defense industry is not the breadth and depth of our labs, both known and sort of underground, which there is that as well. But I think a lot of that private Bell Labsy type work is umbrellaed in government, in government agencies, and I think defense is the big one.
Well, I also think that there was no doubt that war effort was a big reason for having industrial research and development being done in the first place. So it wasn't necessarily to make people's lives better; it was to make, better guns and bombs. And that was, from the 30s, that was a big reason to spend money on innovation in that way.
So just backtracking a little bit, Bell Labs, the general public might not be super familiar with Bell Labs, but probably are familiar with the Bell Telephone Company, I think, which AT&T traces its lineage to that, if I recall. But Bell Telephone Company, I think the year was 1876, founded Bell Labs, to do the things that we've talked about so far: innovation, general innovation too. That's what I think is interesting, is maybe a lot of the early research wasn't going to directly benefit the Bell Telephone Company. Bell Labs, I guess 1956 won the Nobel Prize in physics. I think the transistor was that year. It was, yeah, the transistor, replacing vacuum tubes, and a lot of semiconductor development is directly traced to that. So maybe there were overlaps and benefits for Bell Telephone Company, but I think a lot of the things that the technologies generated from Bell Labs were beyond the scope of Bell Telephone Company, and I think that's interesting.
I mean, I will say that there are, I mean, so let's give some other names here. So Bell Labs is probably the most well known. There's also, and these are places that still exist. So there's Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. That's in Palo Alto, obviously. There's Sandia National Lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, the Naval Research Lab, the Air Force Research Lab.
Los
These are
Alamos.
Los Alamos and Sandia. Yeah, but most of those labs are captive, right? Like Bell is separate and Xerox PARC is separate in the sense that they're not government entities directly. They compete for dollars coming out of other places, but they're not pure research institutions that are being funded purely by tax dollars. They're private entities that are competing for awards from tax dollars. So I've done a bunch of work with a bunch of these guys. I have an AFRL card sitting on top of my desk right in front of me, and it's this is a place where I feel that there's too many layers of. I mean, this is a very thin and corny critique, but there's too many layers of bureaucracy that make these things go slowly, and there's too many people basically trying to skim a cut rather than do the research. And I don't. The thing I always struggle with is, was that not the case in the heyday of Bell Labs, or or if it was still the case, then like what was the economic difference that makes it so that now it takes 8 project managers to do a project that one engineer is actually contributing to? That's the thing, and that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's basically the problem that I've seen with trying to get research done that way. And the counterpoint that gets brought up is a lot about what we talked about yesterday, which is, well, innovation is being done at startups, not at these big behemoth companies. And startups are not doing pure R&D, what's referred to as sort of blue sky invention. They are doing targeted invention for the sake of making their investors money, right? And that it's not really the same thing, and I'm not sure that there's a straight equivalent. The German equivalent, because working in manufacturing and industry, comes up all the time, is the Fraunhofer Institutes. So these are fully government funded, not exactly university, but still university affiliated research organizations in Germany, and they do all kinds of very early stage R&D work. And I come up against them a bunch of times, and they are well funded and deep pocketed. And there are lots of initiatives in the United States that are, hey, well, why don't we have Fraunhofer? What do we do to get our Fraunhofer? And mostly those have not worked at all in the United States.
Why, I wonder?
The closest I can think of is it's simply a difference in preference for way of doing business. I mean, I'm sure that somewhere there's a table of Germans sitting around saying we'd love to have the Silicon Valley of Germany, and it's just not happening in Germany.
So interesting point there for a nice little detour. There are only, let me see if I can get the exact number before I start, because I've made this point several times. Okay, so according to a 2021 AI Index report from Stanford University, there are estimated 40 to 50,000 active machine learning researchers worldwide as of 2020. Now, one might think that is both PhD and non-PhD. A study by Element AI estimated that there were 22,000 PhD holders globally with a focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence as of 2018. Surely that number's up by now. And then Bloomberg, U.S. universities granted an estimated 1,400 to 1,600 PhDs in artificial intelligence between 2012 2017. So somewhere between 25 and 50,000 PhDs globally in machine learning is a real safe. Now that's a fairly large spread, but somewhere between, I'd say conservatively 25 to 35,000 PhDs globally in machine learning. So I think the concept that this technology or any technology has as much opportunity to be, and the vast majority of these are in the United States, by the way. And I think that's the point that I wanted to make. Germany would like to have their Silicon Valley, most of the tech development globally, obviously China has a huge impact, but most of the tech, and when I say tech, I mean specifically digital, Google's, Facebook's, digital technology. Most of that happens in the United States.
Yeah, that's kind of been how I've seen this happening for a long time is no, we're not inventing the next Velcro in a government backed lab. However, we are inventing the next Facebook, the next Google. Those by themselves, I end up kind of I kind of I'm like, okay, these are Facebook started as essentially a toy. It's become an advertising tool. Google started as an advertising tool, and it's still an advertising tool. And I have a hard time putting I have a hard time getting past the fact that we're putting all of the best effort into how do we make a better advertising doohickey and software, even when there's a huge amount of machinery behind it that's all valuable. A lot of the benefits, quote unquote, to society are pieces of it that are really not about the core business of selling advertising. Same thing for Amazon. I mean, there are all sorts of logistics benefits to Amazon, but at the end of the day, moving consumer goods to people from large warehouses, it, it's hard to say that that core mission is clearly for the benefit of society when you say like, great, I have more cheap plastic imported crap in my house than I did 5 years ago thanks to the power of Amazon.
See, that's a concept that I wrestle with a lot too. Is on one hand, the Walmartization, the globalization, and the ability to produce things cheaply in low wage markets has, for especially the Western world, but I think you can say globally, has opened up opportunities to afford things that wouldn't have otherwise been afforded,
Hmm.
but they're disposable, meaning I wrestle with it. I don't really have, you'll get purists on either side that say this is the best thing ever, and you'll get some that say we don't make things like we used to. Both are true, and I don't know from a value perspective. It's up, each person is going to decide for himself or herself what matters. But I don't. I think it's an interesting thought experiment either way.
Consume,
The
the problem is consumer electronics throw it all into disarray. So what used to be you bought a phone from Bell, you didn't even buy the phone from the Bell Telephone Company. You leased or were handed for free the phone from the Bell Telephone Company, and it was designed to last you a lifetime. And everyone had the same black hard plastic phone, and this was the phone, right? So there was no equivalent to, shoot, I need a software update, and my $1,000 device that I bought is now out of date and needs to either A, have a secondary market for it, or B, get thrown in the trash or the shredder. And that cycle of the big ticket and expensive things that we are buying now are not lasting in the same kind of time that they did. And I'm not talking about 50 years ago. They're not the big ticket stuff that we buy doesn't last as long as it did 30 years ago, in the sense that the software needs updates and the firmware will be out of date and it's no longer supported, or the server that was backing it up has come down. Big heavy cars, like this was the second most expensive thing most people own is their car. And the metal part of a car and the plastic part of a car and the fabric part of a car, the mechanical bits and baubles of a car, that those last longer than they ever have before. So it's not uncommon at all to get 200,000 miles out of this most expensive consumer good. The flip side of that is if you buy the latest and greatest car right now, the software will be out of date in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, even though you still have, potentially another 15 years of value of driving that car. So the issue with consumer electronics is spilling over into other things. Of the disposability isn't necessarily in the hardware; it's in the software.
So good point, and I think it's an item by item comparison, and maybe it's a wash. So consumer electronics obviously are disposable, but there's no reference point from 50 years ago other
Exactly.
than the one that you had in your house. But here I have a study from the National Association of Home Builders. Um, that found the average life expectancy of average, again, I like mean or probably another statistic better, but the average life expectancy of a refrigerator was 17 years in the 1960s compared to 13 years in the 2000s. So on average, the average consumer gets 4 fewer years out of a refrigerator manufactured in the 2000s than the 1960s. And then on top of that, and obviously for, again, not a value judgment, just an objective assessment, refrigerators, appliances generally, things of that class were built with more robust components, more metal, which also means a higher cost of manufacturing, a higher cost of shipping. There's an environmental impact that has to be evaluated. So there are a couple of reasons. And then one final point on this, Consumer Reports study looking at thousands of refrigerators found that newer models made after 2000 had a higher average repair rate than those made in the 80s and 90s. So it not only do you get less time out of newer appliances, it costs you more to repair them. And I think probably that's a fair extrapolation across sectors.
The thing that gets lost in this when you're having a casual discussion about it is they don't make things like they used to, which is, I think, intended to imply things used to last longer than they do now, right? And
Which is safe. I
yeah,
think, again, it's a case by case comparison, but I think that's safe.
you think it's safe to just make that claim across the board?
Yeah, because with electronics, televisions, let's see. I think with electronics, consumer electronics, the only caveat that comes to mind right now, because there's no comparison from 50 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
there's no comparison from 60, 70 years ago. But I think every other class, whether it's automobiles or appliances, other big ticket, as you framed it earlier, I think, other big ticket items that consumers purchase, the comparisons tend to favor longevity in items made decades ago because they were made.
Cars is 100% the opposite of that. The typical lifespan of a car 40, 50 years ago was a fraction of what it is today. Cars have been on a very consistent and persistent trajectory of lasting longer and longer and longer and longer over time. The ringer of now you have to worry about the electronics, meaning the cockpit electronics, not so much the drivetrain electronics. That's a recent last 5 years phenomenon. But even still, the average fleet age has gone up year after year forever. The number of years that a typical person can expect to own a car has gone up forever. One of the reasons that it is perceived that cars used to last a lot longer in times past was repairability for any individual car may have been higher up to a point, but things like coverings and paint quality have gone way up. Steel grades have gone up. The plasticization of cars means that there's less stuff to rust in the first place. The other piece that I find funny about this is just because the car would last a long time didn't mean that the occupants would. So a car that could easily be bent back into shape, it was big and heavy and strong and would last through XYZ impact, and the occupants would be bounced around like a ping pong ball and killed. When you design a car to be basically squashed so that you are not dead because you're expanding and extending the time of an impact in a collision, that design choice to protect the occupants by definition means that a car will not be as repairable through a series of minor collisions. So I think that the takeaway though is I kind of want to move on from they don't make them like they used to a second point, which has not come up as obviously in this debate, which is what things do you really want to last that long? So if my refrigerator lasts for 35 years, but for refrigerator technology is improved every 3 years, it's not an advantage to have a 35-year refrigerator. And that's a silly seeming example because, to be honest with you, I don't see what's really going to happen with refrigerator technology. But if you're talking about my home radio, which was this piece of luxurious furnishing that took a lot of months of savings to get to this big wooden classic, home AM FM radio. Having a radio that will last you for 50 years when radio is not the predominant means of consuming media means that you've got how many years of, I've got this great radio that we never use because it hasn't worn out, but the entire world has moved on to television. You know what I mean? So every time you go to an antique shop, one of the items that you can always find very reliably is these big old wooden bodied radios where the actual pieces that are making the music come to your ears and the speakers and picking up the signal, it could fit in a bread box, but it's not in a bread box because they weren't built to be these disposable desktop things. They were built to be, heirloom pieces. And now there's still a bunch of them around. They don't make them like they used to.
You threw out like 6 different
so many things,
concepts that need to be given their own time.
Well, I mean, tie it back to speed and pace of development and the nature of, new idea introduction and where the research is coming from. Tie it back to that.
I want to first tie it back to beauty. And is there a theme and this is off topic from Bell Labs and Innovation, but you mentioned saving up a significant amount of money to buy a 50-year radio. Those were typically ornate and hand-carved wood.
Yep.
I have a 1970s Magnavox console that's huge, record player, that is massive and it's beautiful. I mean, it's poop brown, but it's beautiful. And I think those are the trade-offs.
My record player is a 2019.
Yeah, probably a Crosley, Louisville, Kentucky.
No, I got an Audio Technica. So no, that's a great example, right? So yours is an heirloom piece. Do you know whether it's premium electronics or
it is? Yeah.
So you have premium electronics in a premium body. I have mid upper grade electronics in ugly plastic. You don't want it to be a centerpiece of your house. It plays music, but it's extremely utilitarian unless the vibe you're going for is DJ. And Crosley is consumer trash, basically.
Hey,
right?
tread carefully. Tread carefully.
There. So I wasn't gonna. How much do you know about clothes and fashion?
I know what I like.
Do you know what fast fashion is? Have you heard of this before?
Like print on demand stuff?
No. So fast fashion is this idea that you have runway show level and like designer clothing and trends, which eventually will make it to consumer. So if it's at the Paris Fashion Week, eventually some derivative of that will make it to Target. I don't know why I'm picking on Target. Let me give somebody else. Kmart. They don't even exist anymore. So eventually it will make it to Kmart. And the path from Paris Fashion Week to Kmart has all sorts of dilutions and cheapenings and shortcuttings and adaptation for mass production and. So the idea behind fast fashion was, given that the clothes that end up at Kmart are already, quote unquote, cheap and disposable. I don't even know why I'm quoting that. The clothes are cheap and disposable, right? So you're not going to keep clothes for a long time from Kmart. The idea was, given that the quality is already low, how do you instead shortcut the path from the runway to the rack more quickly? And you do that with higher cycles. So you end up with brands like H&M and Uniqlo and Zara, which were coming out as they were upmarket in the sense that they had more of the design preserved at the expense of quality. So you're still getting cheap, non-lasting clothes, but that, instead of being this negative side effect of the watering down as you go from designer to consumer, instead the design piece is more preserved than the quality piece. And because you're already sacrificing quality, you just have these higher turns. So every season, everything in the store goes to TJ Maxx or goes to whatever second sale place. And then after that, it gets shipped overseas. And the stuff is never intended to last you more than one season. Forget about lasting years and years and years, but it's only made to last that season. And prices aren't particularly high on that clothing that you get that's now better looking, but you basically have people selling, hard goods, meaning physical products, and they're trying to get to this startup dream of what's the recurring revenue model, right? So you're trying to get to, how do I get people to spend more often and more consistently? And one of the ways of doing that is this concept of fast fashion, which had a huge impact on retail design and clothing retailing over the last 15 years or so.
No, I know Uniqlo. It's a Japanese company. Um, Not bad stuff. Um, so the flip side of that discussion, and it's tangential to a point that was made earlier in terms of repairability of automobiles. The classic example of that would be Cuba, where because of embargo and obvious political considerations, they've been stuck with the same fleet of automobiles that they've had since the 50s, and to the point where components that are not made anymore, they make things themselves to keep those cars running. So Cuba, if you and I haven't been, but as I understand it, you see sort of what the 1950s looked like from an automobile market standpoint, because that's where they're trapped. It's the flip side.
Yeah, and those cars last a long time because they have a level of repairability that doesn't exist now. And
Right.
this is the thing that stresses me. Well, stresses me out, probably too strong a word, but it causes me pause when I think about what happens to a high end consumer electronics. So take the best phone, right? You buy the best phone. This is $1,000 to $2,000. And what happens after you're done with it, for whatever the reason may be, even if you wait until it's technically obsolete, uh, there's a robust market for third party repairs. There's a market for first party repairs. You can sell it back to the company that you bought it from. There are overseas markets. There's always somebody that will take an older phone up to a point. It's that, when is the up to a point, right? So the Apple's watch first generation just reached end of support from Apple last week or the week before. And so this is a brand new device there'd never been anything like it before. They invented it, they brought it to market, and now if you have one, it doesn't do anything. It's basically a brick, and there's really not any secondary market for that. And there's no equivalent to that when you're talking about a purely mechanical device built in the 50s. Regardless of whether it's going to kill you, regardless of whether it's using leaded gas, it just doesn't exist as a paradigm now for almost anything that we buy. And I think that things like a business model innovation or financial innovation or marketing innovation being a place where the United States has a tendency to specialize and succeed, that there hasn't really been a conscious reckoning of what happens when we make services and software and we don't make physical goods, in the sense that we're not making them the way we used to. And again, I really think an important point here is that the United States is still the world's second largest manufacturer. There are still many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people employed in manufacturing. We absolutely still do make stuff, but the specialization of, are we primarily a manufacturing economy, or do we have this massive service sector? That's something that hasn't been dealt with collectively, and that's where you get to questions like, well, what the heck happened? What do we do next with Bell Labs?
So great point, fantastic point. Because I was curious about touching on this going into this conversation. With Bell Labs, obviously a lot of and this is to be expected, but with Bell Labs, a lot of and research institutions like Bell Labs, most of the technology, most of the research focus was on physical systems and physical goods. Obviously, that paradigm is flipped on its head. I wonder, and I don't know, I would be interested to know what the ratio of material science, how do you make better pumps, that sort of thing. Is that even an institutional research objective, or is that just an also also considered by the Emersons and the Rockwells. I doubt Rockwell makes pumps, but the big pump manufacturers. Physical systems research and development is probably not an institutional objective anymore. It's all digital.
I love this example because I have quite a bit of real life experience with this. So the inside a pump, the most important components of a pump are the motor and the impeller. The impeller is a little blade fan looking thing. The more complex you make the shape, the more efficient the impeller is, and the more quiet or energy efficient the pump can be. As you get into these incredibly complex shapes, you get more and more gains from the efficiency and noise, which are two major criteria for a good pump. Uh, Three pieces of it are digital. First, maybe only two. First, you have to be able to design these increasingly complex. Well, three. So first, you have to design the increasingly complex geometry, meaning shape of what an impeller looks like. Two, you have to be able to test, is that shape actually more or less efficient? And you need to do that before you've prototyped a whole bunch of these. You need to do it in simulation. And three, you need to be able to fabricate it. So if there's a shape that is incredibly efficient and silent and is going to use 10% as much material, but it can't be made because it is not physically shaped in a way that we have the capacity to physically create that thing, then you have a problem. But when all three of those things are making incremental strides all the time, so we always have better testing being developed, we always have better design tools being developed, that's pure digital, both of those, and we always have better manufacturing capability for impellers are almost all machined. So say we always have better machining capability, and then throw in monkey wrench in the works is like, oh, well, we could also 3D print these things. So maybe that's going to get us a dramatic increase in ability to produce unconventional shapes. So this stuff is all happening behind the scenes. It's things that nobody is thinking about out loud or publicly because it's incremental change. It's not step changes. And the way it works, I have another example besides impellers. Things like basic research into how you cut metal. One of the tools of the trade for researching how you cut metal is a high speed camera. So taking a picture of a close up picture of how is a tool engaging with a piece of metal and what's the formation of the chip. That is a really well established piece of science, right? And two things are happening in the research space now about that. One, as cameras get faster and faster and faster, there is always, there's always another grant available for some university researcher to buy a slightly faster camera, take more pictures of metal getting cut, and publish their test results in more or less the same way that's been going on since the beginning of cameras and machining. So go back at least to the 1950s, that this has been a steady as she goes. You're not it's not a creative endeavor per se. It is taking newer technology and applying it to a known method. The other side of it is arguably more creative, and that's, well, what if we do the same thing in simulation, and then how do we tie the simulation where there is no metal, there is no machine, you're simulating the machine and the metal, and you're simulating the chip, and then how do we compare that to real world testing? And all that stuff is happening in the existing university setting, right? So there's arguably not a need to have these sort of steady as she goes incremental research improvements be done outside of universities, because universities are already doing that. That's the stuff that to me isn't a substitute for Bell Labs, because Bell Labs was looking for big, highly visible, the blue sky stuff, and basic scientific research is still in really good shape. It's like the who's going to invent the next moonshot thing that I'm more questioning where that would come from.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think I'm just curious about, and you indicated that the university would be the source of a lot of that type of research, physical systems research, incremental improvements. I'm curious about who, where, and the investment dollars in digital versus traditional mechanical systems. Like in digital, there's obviously some fuzzy overlap between the two from a testing perspective on mechanical systems, and things that are used to validate existing materials and existing methods and maybe propose new ways of doing the same thing better. But I'm curious, it has to be the flip in research and development, both time spent and research and development dollars has to be overwhelmingly favoring digital. And then the other part of that I'm interested in, I don't think either of us know, we could do some research on this, but the other part that I'm interested in is how much of that is institutional, how much of that is a Bell Labs type company, and how much of it is Google. Transformers, which are the mathematical backbone of large language models, was a Google funded R&D project. How much of that, and others after the fact as well, did research on large language models, but the math of Transformers was a Google funded paradigm. I'm just curious about is that still a national priority, or do we offload that to private practice, private institutions, private enterprises?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that bringing up moonshot and you say, who's the next moonshot? Well, it's a private company that's going to fly to the moon, right? I mean, this is, and what's interesting is I talked about business model and marketing and service innovation. I feel like moving beyond purely government funded R&D for big moonshot projects, I feel like that by itself is innovation. I mean, there are downsides to it potentially, and history may look poorly on it and say it all should have stayed in the government anyway, but certainly the shift away from the government is going to take us to the moon and it will be a national project where we all sit at our TVs and watch the moon landing. You can't imagine that happening again ever. Anything even close to that happening again. And it's not necessarily because we're dumber or society is worse. That's just not how things work now or in the foreseeable future.
I love the story. I reference him a lot, I realize, but I love the story of Elon Musk when he first, the initial planning stages of SpaceX. He was evaluating whether to buy rockets from Russia or to build them himself. And obviously with the help of some other folks, but basically did legit back of the napkin math on what it would cost to build versus purchase them from Russia, and decided to build them. And I think that maybe it's that efficiency and, maybe we don't have the expertise on some of these really advanced digital capabilities in government. Again, I keep coming back to, I think in prior generations, prior decades, the gap between the public's understanding of the technology that was new and innovative in society at that time was a lot smaller than it is today. And I think people understand mechanical systems because they had exposure to them in one form or fashion, either at their house or on the farm or in their line of work. They were exposed to mechanical systems. But I think digital is a different thing. So I think that's what I'm interested in. Does the government have the subject matter expertise in such a massive organization? The government employs a lot of people. Do they have the subject matter expertise to compete with a SpaceX or a Blue Origin? That is the name, right? Amazon's.
Yeah, SpaceX, Blue Origin. There's a couple others. Virgin Galactic.
I don't have the answers for those things, but I'm interested in that interplay. I'm interested in where these are the sort of the fundamentals that I'm interested in, where the subject matter expertise exists. Who's doing the research? Is it private? Is it funded by government? What's the ratio? What's the ratio compared to physical systems 100 years ago, like the Bell Labs?
Yep.
Bell was obviously private. I'm sure there was a significant portion of government funding for Bell Labs as well. But I'm really interested in that interplay because there are only so many, and this is my most evolved, I think, position, maybe at all, but in this type of discussion, is that there are a finite number of people who can do these types of things. It's a very limited number of people. And I just thought, well, there are 190 or 200 and however many countries on the face of the earth. Everybody's got the same ratio of people that we have here. It's not that way. And I think there is a finite number of people who know how to do the things that everyone thinks is. That's why I think the concerns over AI going wild and sort of robotics going wild, there just aren't enough people that know how to do these things. And so I'm interested in where that subject matter expertise lives, who funds it, that sort of thing, comparatively today versus the Bell Labs era.
I wonder if the heyday of Bell Labs was mostly just the golden age of government, not necessarily the golden age of
That's my
R&D.
point. Yeah, that's my point. That's what how would you begin to, I mean, there's a book in there probably somewhere that I don't have the appetite to write, but someone could do a really interesting book. But I want to touch on this because I know we're coming on time. I think for me, and one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the institution of Bell Labs is the language that I'm most comfortable doing machine learning, all this stuff. Obviously, I know Python a little bit, but the language I'm personally most comfortable in is R programming language. It's focused mainly on statistics, but there are a lot of packages out. I'd say the past 5 years that give R users the same functionality as Python users, or really similar in terms of data analysis. But R programming is a derivative, or is an evolution of S programming language, which was developed in Bell Labs in 1976, I believe. And it was developed specifically to evaluate data off of the transistor. And their statisticians at Bell Labs used it. It was such a functional language. They also developed C, which was interesting to me, Bell Labs. But S was a programming language developed at Bell Labs that eventually became R, which is not so much in the tech space because you can do things in Python that you can't do in R in terms of web development and that sort of thing. But R is a pretty ubiquitous programming language that I use and know better than most of them.
R was during the late 2000s. R was the shortcut language to say if you were proficient in R, that must mean that you have some data science skills, or back then we referred to it as big data skills.
Yeah.
And that was the early stages of anybody who can get a job as a data scientist is living the life of what we thought computer programmers were a decade before that, where you had unlimited jobs and unlimited ability to hide inside large companies with no idea what you were doing.
So that's the interesting evolution of this entire field, and it's points specifically to Bell Labs. R was early in data science because statisticians at Bell Labs used S programming language, so R had an early advantage there. But as big data, statistical analysis, statistical models merged with web development, Python became the language of choice. I think you never ever see R as a requirement for a machine learning or a big data job. It's all Python, TensorFlow, PyTorch. Those are, and the reason why is because there's so much overlap with web development tool and the data engineering, data analysis piece, that Python's sort of the one-stop shop. But you find R a lot in universities, and really sort of statistics oriented people use R a lot.
Yeah, not a lot of front end stuff that you do with R.
Exactly. But that's an interesting. Bell Labs is a fascinating story, and I'd like to know more. Maybe we'll try to see if we can run down somebody who's an expert on the people of Bell Labs. But I'd like to know more about the folks who work there and their backgrounds, and it's interesting because I like to sort of tie institutional awareness today of where these types of things are being developed and compare that against what has been done historically. I understand technologically what the differences are, but institutionally, what are the differences? I think that's an interesting story.
Is that going to wrap it for today?
Yeah, I think we're getting closer to our target.
I feel like you're at a stopping point.
Well, I am. I I feel like we should go back through some of these notes, though. We should go back through show notes, because I feel like there are 4 or 5 new discussions that originate from each one of these shows that would be fun breadcrumbs to follow.
Yeah, and we can pull out a clip show when we decide that we want to spend our time editing instead of retalking.
Yeah.
Truly the last refuge of a production cheater, a clip show. Hey,
Hey,
go put on some records. What should I listen to?
from your stash.
Well, tell me what vinyl I should seek out to put on my record player
Uh,
I have barely used.
So I would say I've got my 2 most played vinyl, my 2 most played records. White Album's one, and then Merle Haggard has an album. I think it's from the year I was born. It's in the '70s, the late '70s maybe, called "I'm Always on a Mountain When I Fall." Front to
Yeah.
back, both sides. It's quick. It's like a 30-minute record, but it's beautiful. Um, Kind of haunting in spots. It's just a tremendous record.
White Album's in the collection. Merle Haggard, I'll go check it out.
Yeah, I found it for $3 at. We have a place here called Peddler's Mall.
Mm.
We have 2 locations of them, and a lot of those types of records get in there, and they're still $5. They were 3 when I bought a lot of them, but they're still very reasonable.
We've got the CD seller, proprietor of primarily vinyl and not CDs at this point in time.
Well, all the kids, the new thing, or
Tapes,
the
man.
tapes.
They
Yeah,
sell tapes.
yeah.
Horrible technology.
Yeah, I will not buy tapes. I will not get into tapes. Not going to happen. Now you
I'll
could.
get into a long and heated debate with somebody that's into tapes about how dumb they are to be into tapes.
That's just nostalgia for hipster cool sake. And
It's for
now,
it's for people who didn't live and suffer through tapes. That's who's into tapes.
yeah, and the wind situation. Now I could probably be talked into an even worse technology, and that's
8
the
tracks.
8-track.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I knew how it was. Talk to you tomorrow, Terry.
Have a good one, man.